Okay, hi everyone. I haven't done public speaking in a while, and I'm actually really nervous. So I thought I'd ask you a favor. I'm gonna count to 3, and then could you all just shout your name at me? Like all at the same time, just top of your lungs, like shout your name, okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
1, 2, 3.
No!
Okay. Hi, nice to meet you. Now that we're all acquainted, I'm just going to treat this like a chat between friends, and I'm not going to feel nervous anymore. So as Ben said, my name's Adone. I work at an organization called the Cape Innovation and Technology Initiative. It's quite a mouthful, and so is my title. I'm the Games Ecosystem Manager. It's really confusing, but all it means is that it's my job to implement projects that use game development and gaming to improve people's lives. So we did this project, you might know, called Serious About Games. But on top of that, I'm also, actually, first of all, I was am a social anthropologist. So I'm interested in understanding how we can build a world where diverse people, so whether in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, how people can actually live together and celebrate one another. And I believe that games have a really important role to play in building that world. So, while I was preparing for this talk, I found this book called Diversifying Barbie and Mortal Kombat. It's really cool. If you guys have an interest in this, you should definitely go and read up on it. What this long quote basically just says is that games are a space where people learn about race, gender, and sexuality. So we need to try and understand how that happens and how we can use games to broaden the perspective, so to show a more nuanced view of different people, rather than like reducing them to a single attribute. So I think Richard, hi, hello. You spoke about yesterday how some games you played influenced the way you viewed certain countries, and I think this is a really important point, because we need to take on this responsibility of showing different experiences. And then in that same book, they also say that indie setting in particular offers you a context for reimagining. They're talking about gender in particular, but you can reimagine gender representations in games beyond the exaggerated, the cute, or the abstract. So it's actually a really exciting space, the indie setting, to try and explore that and to see what you can do differently. So how do we actually do that? How do you design games that consider and reflect the lives of others? So a person called Tim, the second talk from yesterday, he was talking about how we design games for marginalized communities, or just tell marginalized stories, and he was saying that we need to change the way we design games. I completely agree with that, and my recommendation for how you can do that is to think like an anthropologist. So I'm going to be, I guess, like giving props to the discipline of anthropology throughout this talk. Please bear with me, it might be a little bit boring for some of you, but I'm going to give you a quick crash course in what anthropology is. I'm going to show you what the benefits of thinking like an anthropologist is, and then I'll give you a few practical recommendations about how you can do that. Cool, so anthropology is defined as a study of human societies and culture and their development. So basically what we do is we study people, we think about or ask questions about how they organize themselves, how they eat, how they pray, how they interact with one another. And we also ask, why do people do things? And try to understand how people make sense of the world. So a really nice and simple way to think about anthropology is as a disciplined curiosity about different ways of life. What I love about it is that you can apply it to almost anything. So you can study communities in World of Warcraft, or you can try and understand how do people use mobile phones to take care of their children, or how you can study the weird and wonderful habits of cat owners. Like within the realm of anthropology, all of this is relevant and worthwhile. I also really love that this discipline makes mundane, everyday things kind of magical. So it lets you think about how the things that we wear, so if you wake up in the morning, you put on particular shoes, how that might contribute to your identity and your sense of self and how you think about where you belong in the world. I did some research on public space, and one really important thing there and how people share that space is how they would share food. So something as simple as buying a bag of strawberries and taking it to a bunch of strangers that might not look very interesting from the outside, but if you change that lens a little bit, you can start thinking about how people relate to one another through these actions. So the main method that we use is called participant observation. So it's a bit of a paradox because it assumes that at the same time you're fully immersed in like an environment or an activity, but you're also taking a step back and reflecting on that environment or activity. So anthropologists who are interested in understanding how people use public transport, for instance, you'll spend months, even years, just riding the bus or the train and talking to commuters about their experiences. Or you could study like corporate culture if you go work at Old Mutual. Or Crystal's doing a talk later today about studying game developers by spending time at a game development studio. So I found that the method is really useful for avoiding, it's a very simple thing, it's just avoiding making assumptions about how people live and rather understanding them on their own terms. So that was my crash course on anthropology, that part is done. Now I want to show you why this should matter to you as a game designer if you're going to be taking on the challenge of making games. And I think with this type of thinking, you can achieve three very cool things. So the one is that you can make more relevant games. So when I'm talking about relevant games, I'm saying things that resonate with people's everyday experiences, but then also games that meet cultural expectations. So there's this woman called Kate Edwards. She was the head of the International Game Developers Association, and she coined this term called culturalization. So you might know about localization, which is usually translation of a game for different settings, but culturalization is a process of taking into account the cultural realities of different settings and adapting the game content to that. So what she does with a company that she started around culturalization is she helps game development companies to ensure that their games are sensitive to cultural realities and that they don't offend like different governments or different cultural or religious groups. And she has some really cool examples that I'll recount for you. So there's a game called Resistance: The Fall of Man, and there's a part in the game where there's a firefight set in the Manchester Cathedral, and you end up like fucking up the entire church. And then the Church of England was really upset about this. And they actually developed something called the Sacred Digital Guidelines. So now in the future, if you want to use any of their properties in your game, you have to come show them and you have to follow these guidelines. She also uses an example of Age of Empires, where there's a section, there's like a historical battle where Japan invaded Korea. But when they released the game in Korea, the Korean government was like, no, we invaded Japan. So they had a completely different understanding, like a conflicting view of that history. So they had to release a patch that changed that battle just for Korea. And then she also worked on a game called Dance Central, which is quite an interesting example because they had to adapt gestures for different settings. So at the end of like a dance sequence, the character would do this. And it seems pretty straightforward, right? But in Greece, this is equivalent to this. So she had to adapt that for every different market that the game would be sold in. And what I really like about this aspect is that even if you don't want to make a game that has a particularly progressive message, even if you're not really thinking about how can we, create inclusive games, it's still worthwhile thinking about cultural realities if you want to sell your game. So if you want to make a lot of money, thinking like an anthropologist is pretty useful. Then you can also make more inclusive games. So I think we all know that games have a bit of a representation problem. Indie games are exploring different types of characters. So yesterday we saw some examples of where that's happening already. But I don't think that the experience of women or people of color, for instance, are often at the forefront of that gaming experience. So I forgot to put the photo in here, sorry. But Feminist Frequency does like a gender breakdown of all the titles featured at E3. You can go look it up on the internet. But what they found this year is that so over 50% of the games featured this year actually allowed you either to choose from multiple characters that are male, female, different genders, or you could create your own character. So it didn't box you into playing either male or female. So that's a really good thing. It means we're sort of starting to make progress around that. But then the games that do still box you into male or female, that's still 3 times as many box you into a male character. So we're not quite there yet. And I think what that means is that there's a large part of the population that just don't see themselves in the games that they play. And I think that being more attentive or attuned to the fact that there are different ways of living and different ways of life can help you reflect these experiences in a game. Then the last one is that you can make more accessible games. So I think when we come up with ideas, even though I am an anthropologist, I think I'm guilty of this too. When you think of an idea for a game, or the games that you play, I don't know if you necessarily immediately jump to the limitations set by the input. So not everyone can use a keyboard or a controller. And we need to start thinking about that up front in the game design process. We need to start making accessibility decisions from the outset so that we don't exclude people who aren't capable of using those tools. So I'd also recommend that you go and check out a charity called Ablegamers. You might have seen them before. It's a really interesting charity. They build custom controllers for people with varying capabilities. And then they also have this incredible resource called Includification. It's from 2012, so it's a little bit old, but I think it's still really relevant. Because they give you an incredible breakdown of how you can, that'll guide your game design decisions. So at different levels of accessibility, they tell you exactly what to do, including things around remapping buttons. You can go and read the whole document. Cool. These are my practical recommendations. Sorry, so those are the 3 cool things that I think you can do. You think like an anthropologist, you can make more relevant, inclusive, and accessible games. So how you can do that then, as sort of practical exercises that I think might be useful, is firstly to position yourself. So ask yourself a couple of questions around where you are in the world and in relation to other people. So how did you get there? And how does who you are, what you are, influence the decisions that you make? I think in anthropology it's really important that when we engage with people or study other people, that we also know how our own realities influence what we see and what we make. Then I think a really interesting exercise is to question your normal. So I think of that in two aspects. So the one is practically, you can like David Attenborough yourself. So think of yourself as an alien looking down on the world and try and see your own rituals, what you do every day in that light. I think that there's a study where someone does that with brushing teeth. So describing brushing teeth as like a weird and wonderful ritual. But that's a really cool thing to try and start thinking about what are the assumptions that you make and how you do things differently to how other people do things. And then related to that is really to just start questioning the assumptions that you have about how people access things. So I spoke a little bit about inputs, controllers, but in the South African context, obviously thinking about how would people download a game? What would they play it on? How much money do they have to spend on data? And what does that mean for the kinds of games that they can play? So I think we very much assume or take for granted the fact that there's Wi-Fi or that people have smartphones, but questioning your normal and going through this exercise can help you identify the things that you might need to address in the process of game design. This one is a very creepy sounding one. Watch and listen. So I told you a little bit about participant observation, and basically this is just that. Watching and listening can teach you a lot about how people do things and why they do things. So I'd recommend that you take some time, if you're interested in understanding something about the human experience, take some time to observe that, and then you can use the observations you've made to actually ask people about their experience. So there was a game they made around commuters and the issues that they have. So literally in making the game, all the developers did was go to a train station and talk to like 30, 35 people, and then reflected that in the game, and it resonated with so many more people than if they had just sat in a studio and made it alone. So I think watching and listening is what gets you out in the world and allows you to see different experiences and take heed of them. And then the last one is to collaborate. So there are obviously people that have an interest in this, like me, and there are also people that already work in different communities. So you could partner with organizations working with, Deaf SA is an organization you could partner with to understand better the experiences of different gamers. What I really loved about the Serious About Games competition that we ran was that game developers partnered up with NGOs that were working in low-income communities in Cape Town. So that means that the experiences that you should be bringing into your game, people have already done some of the research. And by just being cognizant of the fact that that's there, you can already improve the experience of the game quite a lot. So that's what I have for you. If you take anything away from this, I hope it's not that I want you to pursue a career in anthropology, because it's not the most lucrative one, but it's that I want you to think about the lives and experiences of other people when you design a game. So think about how the decisions you make impact other people and how you can use your game to build a world that's a little bit more welcoming. Thank you very much for listening.